In this section, we'll look at the remaining years of the Eisenhower administration from 1955 to 1960 and see how he dealt with Vietnam. In these years, Eisenhower was focused on nation building, and first that meant getting rid of the Emperor Bao Dai, who the French supported. Eisenhower insisted upon a new leader that he thought would be more amenable to pressure. That leader was No Dinh Diem. And with U.S. applying pressure, the French finally gave in, and indeed that sort of signaled the end of the French control. The French were completely pulled out of Vietnam by the end of 1956. No Dinh Diem seemed like a logical choice. He'd attended French Catholic schools and was an ardent anti-communist. As a village supervisor in central Vietnam in 1929, he'd uncovered a communist-inspired uprising and harshly punished its leaders. He served as the Minister of Interior, and he also had nationalist credentials. He'd actually resisted Bao Dai and demanded reforms. He had even lived in New Jersey for a while, attending a Catholic seminary. Under American pressure, the South Vietnam had a vote in May 1955 where Diem defeated Bao Dai. Although it was clearly a lot of fraud, Diem won 98.2% of the vote, including 600,000 votes in Saigon, where only 400,000 people were registered. Eisenhower was very hopeful that SEATO would be helpful in solving the problem in Vietnam. The Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, he hoped, would provide that mutual security that he'd originally called United Action. During the late 1950s, the U.S. provided greatly increased aid to Diem in the South. Private charitable agencies distributed to refugees fleeing from the North and war victims in the South food, clothing, medicine, and shelter. Private supporters of Diem in the South formed the, quote, American Friends of Vietnam to funnel private U.S. dollars there. As for public dollars, Ike poured in more than $1 billion into the economy, and that by the end of Ike's term, Diem in the South Vietnam ranked 5th among all recipients of U.S. aid. By the late 1950s, more than 1,500 Americans were in the South, assisting in a number of ways, both economic and military. And that was, I should note, despite the Geneva Accords prohibition. The U.S. mission in Saigon had become the second largest mission in the world. The U.S. secretly increased its advisors, its military assistant an advisory group, MAG advisors, which were beyond the limits of the Geneva Accord, again, not abiding by those rules. And they were actually training South Vietnamese soldiers offshore. The U.S. also implemented a massive program of foreign aid, most of it through what was known as the Commercial Import Program. The Commercial Import Program was designed to make up for South Vietnam's huge foreign exchange deficit. All that money, of course, going out to pay for the goods they needed. But they wanted to do it without a huge U.S. payment back, which would have led to massive inflation. So under the program, Vietnamese importers ordered from U.S. exporters what they needed, but the U.S. government would pay for it. The Vietnamese importers would then pay not to the U.S. government, but to the National Bank of Vietnam, which the Diem government would use carefully to finance its development projects. By 1961, the Commercial Import Program had generated almost $1 billion in counterpart funds. Despite all this aid, the reality was that Ho Chi Minh remained popular. There still hadn't been sufficient land reform, and Ho Chi Minh was seen as a nationalist by many of the Vietnamese, and Diem was seen still as sort of a puppet of the foreigners. And it became obvious by 1956 that if the Geneva Accords elections were to go on as scheduled, Diem would lose. And so what ends up happening was Diem in the United States decided to simply block the elections. And this was, of course, an awkward thing to do because at the same time the United States was pushing for free elections in Europe. The U.S. tried to argue that the northern violations of the Geneva Accord would disrupt an open election, and thus, blocking the election was justified. They also argued that the Accord simply proposed an election, a wish, not a binding agreement that forced action. As an aside, I should note that the American CIA had already infiltrated the North, destroying printing presses, sabotaging the transportation system, and distributing leaflets supposedly from Ho Chi Minh's government, imposing harsh new laws. All of this was designed to embarrass Ho Chi Minh and, make Diem more popular in the South. So when the United States and Diem blocked the scheduled elections in 1956, the result was that essentially two separate nations now officially existed. There was the Republic of Vietnam, or South Vietnam, which was a yellow flag with 3 red stripes, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, who's had a flag of a red background with a yellow star. Although each side still maintained that it was legitimate government of the entire country, there were actually two separate countries that were in contention. After the canceled election, the problems with Diem actually sort of got worse. There was massive economic aid, as I'd mentioned, to South Vietnam, but America's nation-building efforts were having problems. While many South Vietnamese welcomed all the aid, obviously, there was still considerable suspicion and resentment that America was pulling the strings of Diem. The U.S. aid also was not adequately distributed outside of urban areas, which meant that most of the Vietnamese didn't see the aid. You could see the stores in the cities packed, but out in the country it was still a lot of poverty. The commercial import program had its own problems, including imports that were not needed. They often had a surplus of consumer goods for the city, but what was actually needed were industrial and agricultural imports. And, top everything else off, there was a lot of waste and red tape in the commercial import program as well. MAG, the U.S. military advisors, didn't adequately train the South Vietnamese soldiers in guerrilla warfare, and the South Vietnamese army remained hampered by organizational and jurisdictional problems. So you add all this up, and it really helps mean that the new nation of South Vietnam wasn't really an independent and self-sufficient nation. It was sort of a vassal of the United States. By the end of the 1950s, it was becoming increasingly obvious that Diem's popularity was dropping. He simply lacked the charisma of Ho Chi Minh. He seemed like an elitist, whereas Ho Chi Minh was wearing his khaki peasant attire with sandals. Diem would always wear a white suit, and he was increasingly inflexible and not open to others' viewpoints. And he was also, I should note, this is important, he was Catholic. While most people there were either Buddhist or they were Taoist or Confucianist, they were not Catholics, which was seen as the religion of the colonizers. By the late 1950s, the U.S. was growing increasingly frustrated with Diem. He was simply not doing the democratic reforms that the U.S. had insisted he do. They were having some of the same problems that France had earlier. It appeared that they simply had too much faith in Diem. Diem remained suspicious and rigid and never open to compromise. Actually, 3 of his 6 cabinet members were his brothers. And if anyone disagreed with Diem, he was sent to a foreign country as an ambassador, kind of got them out of the way. In the years of the Diem's rule, the National Assembly, their legislature, initiated no major proposals, but approved almost everything that Diem said. Diem, in a move that alienated almost everybody, abolished local elections and began to appoint his own provincial officials. He claimed that the guerrillas would disrupt the election. He showed little interest in a U.S. suggestion to extend government services to villages or to give more land to the peasants. The French had established these large landed estates, and Diem still was kind of moving very slowly on breaking those estates up and giving them to the poor people, which was exactly what Ho Chi Minh was insisting be done. As time went along, he began to shut down opposition papers, that Diem did, and even incarcerated over 20,000 people on political charges. With Ho Chi Minh's desire to control all of Vietnam, and with Diem's growing unpopularity, it's not surprising that the fighting between the North and the South again began in the late 1950s. The U.S. went to great pains to prove that the renewed fighting was the result of aggression from the North, but there's still considerable historical debate over whether the first sparks were due to northern provocation or simply southern resistance to Diem. Ho had initially laid off the pressuring the South after the Geneva Accords. He had been focused on land reforms in the North, and the Soviet Union had urged him caution. But by the late 1950s, it was clear that Ho Chi Minh had really recommitted himself to growing an insurgency in the South. In December 1960, at Hanoi's suggestion, Southern revolutionaries formed the National Liberation Front, or the NLF. It was a broad-based group led by communists to rally all disaffected people in the South to topple Diem. The National Liberation Front worked in both propaganda and violent ways. They had leaflets, and they obviously found a receptive audience among many of the southern villagers who were upset among Diem's policies. As the Eisenhower administration ended, the National Liberation Front had become known as the Viet Cong to Diem's government of the United States. Viet Cong was a derisive term in the Vietnamese language. And, in the late 50s, the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front, had dramatically increased its violence. By 1958, there were 700 government officials assassinated, and by 1960, there were 2,500 assassinated. There were hit-and-run operations that would make it hard to stop from the military type of fighting that the Diem government was used to. In any event, this concludes the section on Eisenhower in the latter part of his presidency, 1955 to 1960.